Hello, we're back. It's Think and Link, and we're live. We are back in a conversation with Marisa and Tom. This is going to be a great one. Looking forward to all the people that show up for this and have a conversation with us. This event is put on by the team at Capsule, and we have a few sponsors, and you'll hear about them as well as we go through this. We are a special projects firm here in Minneapolis, working on interesting challenges in and around brand design and marketing. We are in a new office here in Minneapolis in what I refer to as the Castle to Beer. It's the old Grain Belt Brewery building. This now the offices of RSP. And the reason that is important is because we're actually going back after this one. It's our last virtual only version of this. We're going to go live again in person in the gathering space at RSP, which is an amazing space here in Minneapolis. And if Tom or Marisa are actually in town at that moment, which I doubt you will be because it's very cold here, I would love to have you visit and hang out with us in the lobby. It will be an amazing event. We'll have a capacity or a limit of 100 people, I think, in that space, but it's going to be good to be back in person again, shaking hands, having conversations face to face. Not that this isn't great, because there are great things about this wonderful virtual environment and the fact that we get to meet and have conversations with such amazing thought leaders in our community. So I'm going to hand it over to Kitty, and she's going to do some introductions, and including herself.
Yes.
And then get us started.
Great. Good. Well, as always, wonderful to be here with you, Aaron, and I'm looking forward to being in person in January in your new offices. So hello, everyone. My name is Kitty Hart. I'm the Vice President of Brand Experience at Heroic. Just a quick intro to Heroic. We are an event production company. So we help our clients with strategy and creative all the way through run of show for big corporate events. And we book speakers and entertainment. So I am thrilled to be meeting Marisa and Tom today as well. So if you are having a need for a big corporate event, need a great strategy and creative partner, you can reach out to me. So always fun to co-host with you, Aaron, and I will kick us off a little bit today. Marisa and Tom, so great to meet you both. Let's start. I always think it's best to start by just kind of handing it over to the two of you so that you can introduce yourself, tell a little bit about your background. So Tom, I'd like to start with you. I've been following you for some time as well, and I'm always inspired by your observations of how technology affects culture and affects economy, et cetera. So tell us a little bit about the work that you do for your clients and your speaking.
Thank you. And thanks for having me as well. Actually, Kitty, you did a very good job of kind of nailing the spirit of what I do. It's looking at how technology is changing what's possible. It's looking at the threats that it creates. It's looking at the behaviors that it changes, and the way that people's expectations are different. So I advise companies on what technology means for their business in a broad way. Most often that involves an element of marketing, but more frequently it's about innovation and transformation. But I like to take a sort of high altitude view of things. I like to travel a lot and work with very different clients around the world. And a lot of what I do is really about asking questions. You know, I'm not particularly expert in any form of technology or any process. But I think by having honest and difficult conversations, then you can create an environment where companies can really change.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it all starts with asking those hard questions.
Yeah.
Sure. Great. Marisa, I love that your background includes executive roles at Estee Lauder, Taco Bell, one of my favorites, and Lowe's. Talk about three very, very different brands. I love that. I will also note, because you may not toot your own horn, you are the recipient of Forbes CMO Hall of Fame and one of the most influential CMOs in the world. Such a pleasure to speak with you. Tell us a little bit about you.
Well, thank you for that introduction. And I wish I could do my introduction in a British accent like Tom's. so much better. Um, but I think my career has been defined by making these sort of unexpected but interesting moves, which have happened progressively, of course, over time. And I think it's actually really helped in turn define me as an enterprise leader and, of course, as a marketer. Going from luxury beauty to fast food tacos to then big box home improvement retail, and being able to be a transformational leader across those industries is what I guess take greatest pleasure and pride in doing. I think my earliest days in marketing, what I realized is it was this unique intersection of business, human psychology, and culture. And those three threads interwoven, that's what's always sort of fascinated me, is how do you bring those things together and do things in ways that connect dots that are unexpected, but then really cool when people see them. So I think that's where I get excited about talking, and particularly in our ever-changing landscape, is I think Tom and I will have a lot to debate and discuss in that regard.
Great.
That's great. I am slightly pressured by our questions here to make sure that they live up to the two of you. But let's start off with what really an intense one. You both seem to have the ability to heat up an organization to create change, which is akin to a virus. Now we can't, things going viral was not cool anymore. Can't talk about that, but in the marketing world, but that is, and it was always a good metaphor to think about. And it seems to come naturally to the two of you, but also sometimes unappreciated organizations, even though they bring you on. I'm curious about, like, it can't be an easy role to be in that, right? When you're facing the contradiction against you. And how do you remain focused? Marisa, do you want to take that one first, or?
Yeah, I'm happy to, because I've had to give this tremendous amount of thought, and I've had to figure out how to apply it in wildly different industries and corporate cultures. And I don't want to sugarcoat it, because sometimes it comes more naturally and more easily than other times. And it really depends on, I think, the way you as a leader approach it, but also how those around you receive it. And you can control for one part, but it's really hard to control for the other. And so it's about questioning and adapting and adjusting and figuring out how to, as you said, sort of stay focused. Once you figure out what that North Star is, how do you get your team aligned to it first? And then how do you get the rest of the organization aligned to it? Mm-hmm. So, and I think in the three big corporate chapters I've had, which are the past 15 or so years of my career, go from Estee Lauder companies, Taco Bell to Lowe's, as Kitty introduced. Each of those assignments has required that. And it's often meant coming in and what you think the situation is, and having the both the humility and the vision to say, I think I know what this is, but what I really want to do is situation assess for myself. Because you never really know until you kind of get in there and get under the hood of a situation, what you think is going to be the big challenge or the opportunity versus what you discover are often not exactly the same. Mm-hmm. And so I think the first responsibility as a leader is to come with your confidence about your intuition, your expertise, but take that moment, even if it's in a familiar industry, it's still going to be a new role, a new corporate dynamic, new things to acronyms of the business, and new talent, and figure out all that. And I think when people say, almost in a cliche way, that first 90 days, it's actually quite legitimate. You need that first period where you're just absorbing everything. And I say the gift of fresh eyes, which is a limited time gift, because after a while you're on the inside and now you know too much in a way, which is good, but then limiting in terms of remembering when you weren't mired in other people's sense, oh, we tried that already, or that's not going to work. And you're just really looking at it without any baggage and saying, this is where I see our opportunity, and this is where our challenges, and then defining where you want to take it. And then that, of course, matures and evolves as you've been in a role longer. And so for me, how you do that is being really clear in your communication of not just the what, but the why. And then also, and this has been harder for me personally, is to recognize people just don't naturally always come along at the same pace. And so you're going to have in any kind, the early adopters, and you want to love and embrace those people. And hopefully they in turn influence the people that are, it's like a bell curve, the middle of the pack, when they see other people like, oh, that's interesting. And then the hardest are the people who are just change resistant. And those are the people who can really be the sort of, the baffles in the cart, if you will. And so thinking about where is that resistance to change coming from? It's usually fear. It's usually a sense of perceived threat to what they do or know. And how do you just, to the best of your ability, apply empathy there to try to overcome those obstacles and get more and more enthusiasm? Last but not least, when you start making moves and they're successful, it obviously breeds more confidence. And then people come along a little bit more.
Yeah. I love that. The balance of humility and confidence in what you know and what you're learning as you get into it. And because it can come across as an abundance of arrogance, but it's really not. It's
right.
a learning process. But yes, having the tenacity to stick with it because the organism needs it. But yeah, that's fascinating. Tom,
my answer is not going to be as helpful, but it's very honest actually. And that's when you asked the question, Aaron, I kind of squirmed a little bit because I can't in good faith say that I have done an enormous amount of this because it's extremely hard to get organizations to change. And when you look at the kind of history of corporate change, it's scattered full of companies that didn't change. Not because every company is existentially threatened, but because most companies can't really change that much. And that's because they're full of people, and people are strange, and they're often quite anxious. And I think often when we're critical of companies that didn't change, we presume that they were so stupid they couldn't see what was going to happen. We presume that blockbusters were ignorant to the internet, or that car manufacturers were, unaware that electric vehicles were coming. Often companies know exactly what's going to happen and exactly what they should do, and they really can't change. And that's why Marisa's in the Hall of Fame, because she's one of the few people that can actually get companies to change, and she's one of the few people that can get people to orient around a sort of vision in that way. So where my answer becomes more helpful is I think we should recognize quite how difficult it is to get companies to change, and we should realize that a lot of it is down to things like empathy, like Marisa says, which we don't talk enough about in this industry. A lot of it's down to clarity. A lot of it's down to saying no to things. And a lot of it's down to charisma, actually. I realize these days that charisma is one of these characteristics that we're most embarrassed about because it kind of aligns a bit with awkward things like, sort of Me Too-like conversations, or it aligns a bit with people that work too hard, or it aligns a bit with cult-like behaviors. But I think there is something extraordinary about having an incredibly strong leader that gets people to rally behind them, that listens to people, that intrinsically creates a sense of belonging and an alignment with the vision. And not that we necessarily want to take this conversation into remote work versus working from the office. But I think we have this extraordinary moment of time where I think people are quite lost. I think people have forgotten what their role is within companies. And I think there's an enormous opportunity for brilliant companies full of amazing people that have succeeded for centuries in making profit and increasing revenues quarter on quarter. It's actually those companies, if we can get them to change slightly, that probably will own the future, rather than all the tech companies that we always talk about the whole time.
Yeah.
I just add one thing to tell about the whole, why companies don't change is there's a classic, I think it's pretty classic, 2 or 3 panel cartoon, and I've put it in presentations I've given, and I can tell Tom knows what I'm talking about, and I can describe it very simply. The first panel is who wants change, and everyone's hand is up in the air, and the next is the speaker says who wants to change, and all the hands go down. And the interesting thing is I always thought that was the whole cartoon. And then when I was looking pull it recently to put it in a presentation, I realized there was a third panel. And the third panel is who wants to lead the change. And then instead of no hands up or down, now there's no one even there. And I thought, my gosh, that is like, so it's a sucker's bet maybe to be the one that's like, sure, I'll lead the change.
Right.
I'll get really personal for a second, and say that one of the things I think as a leader with not a traditional corporate personality, as a woman, being in these very big corporate environments, and one of the things that I think I've had to try to reconcile is you can't be a true agent of change and expect that everyone's going to be happy and like you all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think by nature I'm a pleaser. So that's really something that I've struggled with in terms of why is it hard? Because that cartoon tells you why it's hard.
Yeah.
Like people conceptually want leaders and want teams that want change, but they don't really want to change. And that is the tension that creates shorter CMO tenures, that creates it speaks exactly to what Tom was describing. It's not that there aren't smart people in these companies. So what was the problem? Well, you want it conceptually, but are you willing to actually take the risks and do the things that are scary? And generally because you don't know how they're going to go right away.
Mm-hmm.
And you're in a public company environment where you're going quarter to quarter on earnings, risks are by definition risky. That's the fine risks. We glorify risks in culture, high risk, high reward. We forget that risks are risky, just like making career moves so that means they're not always going to work. So it really becomes cultural is, are you leading an organization that knows how to take smart risks and not just talk that talk, but walk that walk? And those to me are the companies that are going to actually evolve successfully because they don't just say they want leadership like that. They celebrate leadership like that.
Yeah. We do want to talk a little bit about, you touched on the short tenure of the CMO. This has been perplexing. So I do want to talk about that. But one thing that I'm also thinking about is that part of this change has to be identifying those people that just aren't going to be able to go there. And so the right decision is identifying that, okay, then it's probably time for this person to go. Wasn't Zappos one of the first companies that came forward and said, we try to identify as quickly as possible when we have someone that they are not a match for the culture, for the mission, for whatever, and we actually pay those people to leave. Like within 30 days or something, they try to identify that. So that sometimes has to be a big part of the change, is identifying those people that if you're not going to be on board, then you got to get off the ship, right?
I think something that a lot of younger companies do very well is they have a lot of clarity about what they're about. And therefore, when people join an organization like that, you can't be surprised when they behave consistently with their values. And I think someone like Patty McCord is very interesting, the writer of the Netflix culture deck, because when she speaks to various different audiences, and I've done quite a lot of speaking tours with her, there are some groups of people that love everything that she's about. And a lot of it is about this idea that people should be rotated out of business and people should work really hard and they should be really committed. And being asked to leave a company isn't a sign of failure. It just is about sort of timing. And a lot of audiences find that very, very difficult to stomach. And I think we're in an interesting time in the world more broadly, where for a lot of times, people were not expected to love their jobs. Like the idea in the 1930s or 40s that you'd worked for a company that would sort of bring to life your purpose in life would be extraordinary. But you probably would be rewarded with a degree of loyalty, and you probably would be taken care of. And then sort of now we're in this sort of weird area where we're not really expecting people to be taken care of. There's no sort of gold carriage clocks for people who work there for 50 years. People don't really have rights, but at the same time, we're supposed to be sort of very nice and very polite and sort of really enjoy each other's company the whole time. And we should seek to have colleagues that are actually friends. And at some point in the middle, I guess we had sort of people like GE and Jack Welch, rotating people out of the business, which created a ton of fear. But I think more broadly, we need to look at all these different sort of tonalities and relationships with our job and try and pick out what is right. Is it useful for people to think of their careers as a series of sorties, where you join a company and you expect to leave after 3 years and you do a performance plan for 3 years. And there's no sense of resentment or weirdness if people leave at the end of 3 years after accomplishing what they've done. And I think sports teams provide a kind of an interesting analogy for how to think about some role.
Nice.
Yeah, and I think the most important thing is that companies are honest, and people are honest with themselves. And some people thrive under pressure, some people crumble. The idea that there are performance reviews where people rate each other and some people are let go is terrifying for some people, but brings out the best. But I think as long as people are honest about these things, then probably it works best for everybody. So
yeah. We do have to acknowledge Todd, who has been another change agent, a client and on this. He just made a comment about and avoid the de-risk, which often neuters the change entirely, right? This idea of, the legal implications or, all that part of the culture that shows up as de-risking. An elegant comment for sure.
Yes.
And appropriate coming from Todd and Dave Schneider, also a past speaker. Show up. There you go. See? Kitty, back to you. You had a question.
So Tom and Marisa, can you see the chat?
No.
You can. No?
But I can probably do it if I press a button.
I can. So thank you for those good comments.
Yeah.
You'll have to acknowledge them. There's no thumbs up that I see.
Yeah, for all of you that are
you're
tuning in, please drop a comment. Let us say hello. Let us know that you're here. Tell us where you're tuning in from. That would be great. Okay, so I want to go back to the short tenure of the CMO. What is going on with this? How can a CMO even get some traction and create results within such a short time frame? What's going on with this?
Well, I brought it up, so it'd be remiss now not to talk to it.
It was one of our questions too, so I was glad.
Obviously, a little bit of a conflicted point of view about this.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, I think it's a bit of the clickbait of our industry. And so that bothers me. Every time a CMO changes roles, it becomes this sort of, literally almost without fail, the industry headlines are, is this the end of the CMO role? Or so it becomes very sensationalized. And I think there are some people who have vested interest in sensationalizing it, and it doesn't quite serve our function well. And I feel very passionate about this because I'm connected so deeply into the CMO community. And they're truly, I feel so lucky that these are my peers and my colleagues are some of the most amazing talent across functions that I know. So on the one hand, I do think it's a bit sensationalized. And if you ran the numbers a little differently and realized, well, sometimes it's, people are leaving because they want to leave, or they're getting promoted, or they're doing different jobs. So that, but it doesn't always get reported that way. There is, though, I think, some truth underneath the sensationalism, and that does need to be discussed without the dramatics. And I think there are some very important reasons behind that. One is when you think about C-suite functions, generally speaking, the role of a CFO is the role of a CFO is the role of a CFO across companies and industries. The fact that the CMO role, like what is the job, the CMO is so variable from company to company and based on who, the nature of the industry, the nature of the CEO or the other leadership team, that's tricky. Because just, you might come in with your view of what it should be. And if that's not clearly aligned in the organization, or if it shifts on you, of course, that's going to create tension. There can be issues of accountability without the responsibility. Did I say that right? I sometimes invert the two, but you know my point. So I think it's a very easily scapegoated role. I think culturally it may not be understood, but again, it's variable. I've worked in industries where marketing is the absolute center of, of the axis around which the globe of the company revolves. And I've worked in industries where that's now not the case. And so I've really had a purview, not just looking at one view of this, to try to understand it. But I do think it comes to this idea of driving change. And I have a new theory about this. And I'll share it sort of for the first time here is, I wonder if there is a nature of the people that are in these roles that tends to feel very much like the stewards of the consumer, and therefore tend to express a different level of bravery around the table. And that ties to this idea of willing to be change agents. And I would venture that the CMOs that have taken more of a sortie approach, like Tom said, tend to be the ones that are more about big transformational change. Those aren't the people that are necessarily sitting back and just, operating and staying in roles for a long time. So my point is, it's not necessarily all bad news unless we continue to stigmatize it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to reframe this as this is a unique kind of talent who comes in, does what they do, may challenge the status quo differently. And then, either the organization is ready to move on, or they're ready to move on, or some combination, or they move into a new role, whatever it is. But maybe, although, certainly I don't think I ever envisioned that being my life, that it would be in a few year chapters. Maybe it's not a bad thing. It's energizing for the individual and for the company. But so long as it comes from the positive of that and not the lack of understanding, the lack of respect, the ability to, the proclivity to blame, then I think we can have a little bit of a more benevolent view of this headline and not make it like the death knell of the CMO every time one of us moves.
Yeah. That is a wonderful perspective. They have and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Tom, the English version of a turnaround specialist is a company doctor. And so you're saying the CMO is really the company doctor, right? They're the turnaround, or turnaround might be a little too extreme. It might be that, they're the chief virus officer. Right. I mean, you're willing to take on the change. I don't want that one. That'd be bad. But, that's interesting, because you think about any of the other roles, it's not often that they're coming in that way. Most of the viruses that I know, or the people that are come from that perspective, which is really fascinating and not clickbait. That's really good. Tom.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Marisa that this is one of these headlines that gets replayed every time there's something that fits into that narrative. And if you actually look at the data, it hasn't changed that much over the last 20 years. And it's actually not that different to most roles in a company either, to be honest. One thing I find, it's not particularly linked to this question, but I find quite interesting, is that the CMO role is a very unusual role at a senior level, because no one thinks that they can do anyone else's job other than the CMO job. No one looks at the CFO's, end of year statement, goes, the way that you've amortized the cost of printer toner, across an Indonesian supplier. I disagree with that. No one goes to the sort of head of, the sort of legal profession and say, the way that you structured this contract makes no sense to me. My 8-year-old kid had a look at it and thought that the font was bad. But the CMO role is full of people that will go into the quarterly meeting and say, great job, Julia. I just wish the t-shirts were a darker shade of red. No one does that. I'm not saying that people kind of think they can do the job, but people think that it's okay to have opinions on the job. And I think what we really have probably at the moment, and this is oversimplifying it, but there are CMOs that are absolutely amazing. And there are CMOs that have their opinion either formally or informally invited into all sorts of critical corporate matters. And these are some of the most important people in business. And they're absolutely vital, and they're quite rare. And then there's another group of people that either because of the permission they have, or because of the company in which they work, or the role that they've been sort of assigned, they don't have anything like as much power. And I think what we're really seeing at the moment is some CMOs who are rising to spectacular levels and making a huge difference to their business. And we're seeing others that are much more sort of peripheral. And those people tend to be more easily and more readily replaced. And I think that probably brings us on to another topic, which is related to this, but it's about the idea of short-termism. And I think I don't see many people talking about this at the moment. I think as we move towards a digital environment where everything is sort of interactive and where everything can be measured much more quickly, much more cheaply, much more immediately, I think we're starting to see a lot of companies focus on metrics that they can change most readily rather than things that matter that much. And I think 5 years ago, that meant that people had slightly different conversations, and CMOs were asked to be aware of this new language of data. And I think increasingly it's meaning that actually CEOs are now starting to ask of their marketing department that these very immediate metrics are focused on a very real-time basis. And I think that's massively to the detriment of what marketers do and what brand building is about. And in a way, and it's not my place to say what's interesting, in a way, I think that's a bigger conversation and a more relevant one to be had, which is what, as a profession, do we do about and irrelevant metrics as well.
Yeah.
Okay, I have to jump in on that because I could not agree more. I think this is, when we talk about the conundrum of the point in time where we are, is where we are in terms of measurement and analytics. And I call it a conundrum because there's seemingly so much, and there is, that it's created a panacea that does not serve marketing well. That everything is measurable at this point, so just prove it to me. Just prove me more. And I wish I knew who to attribute this quote to, but it goes back way before digital and was something along the lines of what's most important, what really matters is not necessarily measurable, and what's measurable is not necessarily what really matters. But so that's where I could not agree more on the short-termism and how it can really skew the activities that you do, the media you buy. And I mean, this is not, I can't say a totally original thought, but the fact that we as marketers, who should be the best communicators, have allowed, whether it was Google originally or others, to create a part of marketing that we labeled performance was the worst possible thing we could have done, because you put anything else in any other column, and what are you effectively implying? It's not performance. And usually we all know what goes on the other side, brand versus performance. This was the dumbest, worst thing we've allowed to happen to ourselves. And we allowed it, and we still do it. As much as I preach this, I still catch myself doing it. And it's terrible because brand equals performance. Why would you do it otherwise? It's just, but things aren't measurable in the same ways. We can measure media channels, but we can't necessarily isolate creative from it. So I find this incredibly frustrating, because when you're sitting at in front of a board of directors or in front of your CEO or C-suite, and they're like, well, how did that work? Or show me. And you're doing the corporate equivalent of humana, because you do have some data, you really do, but it's not always consistent. It's not always aligned in the industry. And you're doing your best, and you know what you know, like, you know what's important. You just may not have the immediate perfect measurement for it. It takes the conversation, or can take the conversation, into some dangerous places. And particularly, I'm going to say for public companies, but it's probably the same for private companies that have, investors that are breathing down their necks. Like, you get into this, well, so I'll just do paid search because it looks like it has a 5-to-1 ROI on my e-commerce site, missing the bigger picture. Like, how did anyone search you in the first place? Well, they had to know about you. They had to care about you. They had to be interested in what you have to sell or do. So, sorry, I jumped right up on the soapbox on that one.
Boy, did you ever. That was great.
Marisa, do you have any particular sort of tools at your disposal, or things that you've done in the past to sort of help fight that battle in a way? Because I know that many of the CMOs I've worked with, they always had this sort of pressure for short-termism, and they always struggled to know how to sort of change the parameters in such a way that they could just basically say, just trust me, I'm really good at my job. I can't sort of prove it with a real-time dashboard, but just let me do things and it'll work out. Do you have any tools? Or
I think the problem is it feels like a little bit of a tapestry right now, depending upon what, the size of your company, what tools, hard and soft metric wise, that you've invested in, and then how you try to weave the story to make sense of it. So I feel like, in my own particular leadership roles, I've done my best to use good judgment and use measurement and then there is a little bit of trust me, and then that becomes a little tricky. And then, of course, some things are going to impact sales right away and some things won't. that's really your short-termism point, is when business gets tough and you're saying, but we've got to invest in the longer term health of the brand. I mean, and again, put a little empathy around it. It's understandable that a CEO, a CFO might be like, well, you know, that seems like the easier thing to cut versus something that feels like proven. And I found myself using more industry studies and data that have been out there for a while, frankly. So it's a little surprising that there hasn't been more robust ways to tackling it in the industry groups I'm in. I mean, I certainly have been vocal about making sure this is on the agenda, but it's not like, I mean, I think the MMA is doing a wonderful job trying to tackle this. It's been on the agenda for the ANA, but it's not simple. Understandably, it's not simple. And that means that everyone's kind of doing their own job navigating it.
Yeah, it brings about a whole bunch of other conversation, a whole bunch of other things that we could go down, and we could be here for hours. It creates a whole bunch of thoughts for me about, we had a past client who was at Sleep Number for a short period of time. Sleep Number is a local brand, and they measure everything. And I remember that when he got let go and they started cutting back on marketing, he's like, why would you ever cut back on marketing? If you're measuring everything, then theoretically, you should never be cutting back on marketing, right? If you're so proficient at it, you know, then you shouldn't be overspending ever, because you know what you're spending on. But it isn't possible to measure.
It also goes into practical realities, Aaron, where marketing's one part of a P&L, and it's the easiest, often one of the biggest and therefore most vulnerable line items. This goes back to the who wants change, who wants to change. It's like, well, sure, I'm willing to take that chance, but right now I've got to make my quarter. So I'm going to cut and you'll figure it out. Like that kind of thinking. This happens in companies all over. So I'm not picking on anyone. It's endemic. I want to just quickly address Todd's question and comment, because I do think that is, I should have spoken to that. His comment was thoughts on aligning metrics along the funnel from longer term brand consideration to short term. I do think that's the right way of trying to look at it. As much as we know the funnel's trite, I have come to believe it's, if you're going to pick a trite metaphor, you might as well use that one, because at least it makes some sense, right? Like, how do I even, there is no bottom of the funnel without a top of the funnel. Like, at least say that, people are like, oh yeah, you're kind of right. So at least thinking about measuring, you know, how it all kind of comes together and supports each other. Yes, I do think brand health trackers, as Bob said, all that's part of it. At the end of the day, you still made the person sitting with a big budget cut figuring out how to make sense of doing what you aspire to do. And then what are the things that naturally get cut? The things that feel more experimental, that might be the game changers. All brings the whole conversation together. And where the de-risking, right? No one's going to cut the things that, well, that looks like it has an ROI. So problematic, because we do have to show the value of all of it together. And there are good tools, but they're not perfect yet. And they don't factor in message, the most important part. They're more about the dollars than the message. Yeah.
Wow. We definitely hit a hot topic for you for sure, which is great. I love that. And I could go on for a while.
Well, Aaron, it reminds me of, so a lot of the work during my days at Capsule, and Capsule still does a lot of naming and things like that. We would always call the legal, every time we would create something, then it has to go to legal and they chop everything down. We'd call them the anti-marketing department. I feel the same way with the CFO, right? And that a lot of what we just talked about here is, let's chop marketing, let's shave there. And it's like, it becomes the anti-marketing department almost. So that's what popped into my mind with that whole conversation.
Yeah. So, the next question is, I think it's my question, isn't it, Kitty?
Yep, it's yours.
We've had Paco Underhill on here before, and Marisa, I look back in, and you've done had a lot of conversations about why people buy things, and
Mhm.
he actually authored the book Why We Buy, which I absolutely love, and he's been a
Great.
great influence on my life. But I'm curious your view on why we as humans buy. What drives us to decide between a Taco Bell and a Taco John's? Kitty may be a Taco John's fan. I'm a Taco Bell fan, or Taco John's
Yeah.
fan. And those two could have better names. I mean, can we just not use taco at the beginning of a name for a taco joint? Anyway, I'm Taco John's. She's Taco Bell. Or between, of course, Lowe's and Home Depot. And when they've, in many ways, hit parity, right? What are those things that get people to decide to buy or go in the direction of one versus the other? I'm curious your perspective on that.
Do you
Why
want me
we
to start
buy?
here, Tom?
Yes, jump in.
Me? Okay. Well,
Yes.
I'll try to brief and then kick it over to Tom. I mean, what it really comes down to when all is said and done is actually something incredibly simple to express and incredibly hard to ascertain, which is a value proposition that's individualistic, because we all do this mental math a zillion times a day on, is something worth it? And this is where it's really important for businesses and marketers within those businesses to recognize that a value proposition is not just about price. It's about a composition of factors that make you decide to choose something. And that's where the role of brand comes in, because it's irrational as much as it's rational. But it may come into other things like, well, maybe I like Taco Bell better, but that Taco John is down the street. So it's worth it to me because it's convenient. So then convenience factors in. Or that salesperson in that store is so nice to me, I'm willing to pay a little bit more for that dress because I just always know I'm going to have a good experience there, which is why we buy luxury, right? It's not obviously not about price, and yet it's still a value proposition. So for me, the answer to why people buy is, have you figured out how to make it worth it to them? Or you understand why it might not be worth it to some people and worth it to others. And then when you unpack that, you start to figure out actually how to talk to people, and probably on more than one dimension. So that for me is, across these different industries in which I've worked, has become the common denominator. And my easiest synthesis, of course, it's a lot harder to answer it, but at least if you start with that being the core question. And by the way, companies aren't always honest with each other. It's sometimes really hard to be self-critical and say, you know what, we want to be all about service. And then in reality, your service proposition isn't that good. Or maybe it's good, but it's no different than everyone else's. And so that's where the hard enterprise level conversations have to come out. And that's where brand and the company, the product, the service have to be inextricable, because what are you going to stand for? And that's where I believe the role of the marketer is so much more than the marketing activity itself. It's about helping the company understand that, like, what is going to drive the business is understanding who your customer is, who your customer opportunity is, and what's going to make what you're offering worth it to them. And if you don't have that right, there's a flaw in the underlying business.
I think it's an amazing question, actually. And I think every single marketing department should have this sort of emblazoned across one of their walls. I think something very, very strange happens in marketing. Like in some ways, we've got the best job you could ever have, because it's our job to understand people, and we are people. And therefore, most of our lives, we're able to do our job just by thinking about ourselves, or people we know, or people that we don't know but are very different to us. It's the act of empathy that really drives everything we do. Something very weird happens, I think, when people sort of leave, when people get up and they have breakfast, with their sons and daughters or by themselves, and they think about all the things in life that they think about, like, bills that need to be paid, and, is your kid getting on okay at school, and do they have enough friends? And then in the process of getting to the office, we sort of take off our human head and we put on our marketing head. And then we talk about brand purpose, and we talk about, brand onions, and we talk about paths to purchase, and we talk about, consumer archetypes. And pretty much from 9 till 5, we'll talk complete nonsense. Like we'll sort of share this language that everyone sort of nods their heads, and we'll talk about things that we can measure. And by and large, if you ever had like a normal person in any meeting, they'd sort of sit there dumbfounded, thinking it was some sort of conceptual art project where, we're talking about busy mums. It's like, the sort of level of thinking is quite crude. And people are saying things that are just wrong. So in a way, the most important job I think of someone a bit like me or an agency is holding their clients account for the fact that they have the worst possible vantage point to see their brand from, because they are intrinsically too close to the brand. You know, you will think about your toothpaste as much as you will think about your shoe polish, probably. You will think about your car as much as your cooker brand, perhaps. And I think the point of bringing an outside perspective in is vital. And one of my favorite exercises to do actually is to look at the things that people own and to try and figure out and talk to them about why they bought that. Because you realize, as Marisa was saying before, you know, people do all sorts of very strange things. Like we're highly illogical. And so much of marketing, and I don't want to sound like Rory Sutherland here, but so much of marketing is based on the idea that we're making sort of economically rational decisions. Whereas actually, you know, the whole point of Tupperware parties is that people buy things that they don't need because they feel awkward if they don't buy something. You know, I think somehow in marketing, and this is sort of joining up some of our points before, for most of human civilization, marketing was a sort of mysterious, magical relationship business based on sort of trust and relationships and an acknowledgement that there's a weirdness to life. And that if you come up with an amazing idea, an amazing idea is almost like alchemy, where you can kind of create value from a combination of things that isn't intrinsically there. And I promise you, I'm not sort of miserable about technology at all. Technology is amazing, but I think on when we had people like Google come in and talk about performance marketing, which, like Marisa says, implies that everything else doesn't do anything, we basically conned ourselves that marketing was a science. And we felt that if we had a real-time dashboard and we could sort of tweak this dial, we could sort of push that slider up there, we can sort of bring this one down, push that one up, and then this number gets closer to 1, and then that's good, and then we do this and that gets closer to 1. And I think we're in a culture where we think the marketing is a science, and we think that if an ad reaches someone that doesn't buy something, it's wasted. We think that if someone buys something immediately and we can claim attribution for that, then we've succeeded. And actually, a lot of this stuff is really flawed. You know, NPS, if you ask me, is a complete waste of time because it doesn't tell you the motivations behind it. I think last touch attribution is a complete waste of time for most items, because most things you buy because of maybe a 5 or 15-year process of realizing that Samsung is a big brand. I don't know what they do when I'm 7 years old, but I know they're big. You know, Continental Tires. I've got no idea what Continental Tires is like. I've got no idea what their brand statement is, but I know they're big because every time I watch a European football match, I see their signage around the stadium. You know, I know that's a tire that's not going to, you know, be a terrible decision to buy. And I think we need to sort of take a step back and learn from both. We need to realize there's a sort of magic to ideas, and there's a sort of wonder to humanity, and there's an irrationality to humanity, and wastage often is good, and people not buying something immediately is good. And then we need to sort of combine, where appropriate, the thinking of the world of science and apply logic and measurement in sensible places as a proxy. But I think we need to sort of stop praying at one altar and start to sort of realize the beauty to both of those religions.
Well put.
Yes.
Well put. Damn. Yeah.
Very good.
That goes back to corporate culture. You know, are you going to be standing on an island of one preaching this? Or can you, I mean, I'm like, amen to what Tom's saying, but I already believe that. And I feel passionately about it, but it's really hard when you have people that don't have that mindset, or maybe they'll crack the door to the mindset, but then too many other realities and their own functional issues come on board. And it's like, well, that sounds lovely, but, you know, I could be spending our dollars on these number of operational things that need to get fixed or that. So why should I indulge? You know, and I purposely use that word because language, you know, you can see how it can get tagged quickly as something not essential, not business critical. And that becomes sometimes it's the death by 1,000 cuts, not just the, you know, of mindset. And that's sad, because I agree. Like this is, call it, you know, art and science, math and magic. It is both. It is both.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to know your experience, Marisa, actually, but what I see is almost two different worlds, and you know, maybe calling it religion is a little bit offensive, but there are like different tribes, and they sort of they appreciate a different sort of credo somehow, and it's very obvious in meetings which is the dominant one, because it's normally 90% plus of one particular way of thinking. And if you go to a sort of direct to consumer footwear brand and start talking about brand and values and customer service, they look at you like you're a complete idiot, because they live in the world of the real-time dashboard. And the opposite is true as well. And it is interesting, you know, how can we bring an appreciation of what both elements can bring to business and find a way to use them in appropriate ways.
Yeah. No, I don't think referring to it as religion is offensive at all. It totally fits, right? Yeah, it's a belief without really having full knowledge of it, right? It's impossible to know for certain on either of those, even though on the number side in that camp, they think they do. No, they think they've got more certainty, but that's just numbers. You're just looking at numbers, right?
I was having dinner. I'll jump in a quick story. I was having dinner a couple of years ago now with a big industry leader, and you know, just talking about what it is to drive change and the role of creativity and the pushback that you sometimes get. And he said to me, Marisa, creativity is inherently chaos, because new things, I mean, if you think about, if creativity is really newness has never been done before, which means it's inherently messy and doesn't have a process or an order to it. So once it's in the world, then it becomes, you know, you can kind of make it more efficient or whatever. And I thought, wow, that's just such a perfect articulation of in my past experience when I've gotten pushback on, we're working harder because we don't know how to do it, because we've never done it before, and it's making people stressed out. And it's like, well, because if you're going to do something different, you have to understand that it is going to be, it won't be orderly. And the problem is big organizations generally like order. So that's a little bit of the cultural and organizational rub too. And it goes back to my cartoon, is I think that's also why people don't like new creative changes, because it's inherently harder, because it's not, if it hasn't been done before, it's inherently harder because you don't know how to do it, and you don't know how it's going to do until you do it. But the dividends are obviously potentially extraordinary, because you might actually make a difference. You might actually break through. You might actually get people to think in a new way. And that's the reason why you want to pursue it.
Yeah. Yeah, there has to be an acceptance and an understanding for the organized chaos that is the creative process. And unfortunately, there are just always going to be those roles inside companies that's not their world. So it is going to be hard for them to understand and accept that and say, okay, do what you need to do.
Although that doesn't mean that creativity has to be chaotic, because I used to work in a quite famous, very creative ad agency, and you couldn't ever book a meeting room because all the systems didn't work, and it was all about who could barge their way into meeting rooms. It was all about ego. And one day I said, you know, just because sort of chaos and creativity are somewhat linked doesn't mean that we have to create chaos in all directions. Where, you know, you can't claim your expenses, you know, because you need to sort of charm the right person. It's like it doesn't always work like that.
Yeah.
Organized chaos.
Right.
Organized. I think it's up to you, Kitty. And I don't know if you're going to go with this question, because this is a big one and it could take us into the next hour to cover this next one, because it's such a beast. But I think you should ask it. I think I got.
Well, I'm assuming that you and I are looking at the same question. Can we talk about Twitter? I think there's just a lot of general curiosity right now on what's happening at Twitter, what's going to happen, the good, the bad, the ugly, right? On this, curious about your opinions, both of your opinions on what's happening there and where is it going?
It's a very hard thing to talk about quickly. Do we have to stick to the time limit or not?
Well, we could go beyond. I don't have anything else, but not too much beyond.
I mean, it's still, I think, this sounds quite rude, but I think we probably talk about this too much, actually. I think there are lots of things in the world that really, really matter. There are lots of really significant things, whether it's to do with the state of the world, to do with politics, to do with people's lives, to do with problems with mental health at the moment. So in some ways, I think we talk about stuff a bit like this too much, and it's a bit inside baseball. Sure, I think Elon is a completely flawed person. I don't like his intentions, but I think he'll probably do quite a good job with the platform. I think it will probably be such that in a year's time, when it comes to the technicality of the platform and how it works, it will probably be better than it was before. And all of these people that make a lot of noise about moving, like probably many of them will move back. What it means as an advertiser, I think advertisers are very quick to advertise the fact they're making statements the way they do. And often I think many of the brands that say we're not going to spend any money are often ones that weren't spending money there in the first place, because it's sort of politically advantageous to sort of make these statements. I think in a way it would be better off if everything in life didn't become political. It'd be better off if we didn't make everything a battle between one side and the other. Yes. I really like being British in America because I feel like I haven't been given the two set menus of belief systems I'm supposed to choose from. Sometimes I want the duck, and that doesn't mean I'm an asshole. So I don't know. I think the more that we can focus on other things, I think the better. And I'm not trying to be rude about your question. So
no, that's good. Marisa, any point of view that you want to express? Other than you haven't been really back to it, you're kind of cautious about.
Well, I mean, here and there. Look, sometimes these issues are hard to separate your own personal, belief system and values, and then thinking about, what you would do as steward of a brand in this situation. And sometimes it's very clear and the two go hand in hand. But I mean, for me, just the most problematic part is, the I think, concerning personality of Elon and the decision to just unleash the beast again on hate. And this is not subjective. It's not my opinion. The data shows a frightening double-digit increase in the rise of hate speech, anti-Semitism, racism, all of it on the platform. And I just don't see how that is a debatable point of whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Like, free speech is not unlimited, and it should not create threat to the health, safety, and well-being of our fellow human beings. And call it Pollyannish, but I mean, I think there are good things we can debate in social media and use it to connect and communicate. Which, as someone who is one of the earliest clients in social media, I feel like witness to the revolution, and I advocated for participation, and it's taken some really crazy left turns in terms of the divisiveness in our world, misinformation, disinformation. I find that incredibly concerning. I really do. So I don't see how that's in any measure net positive since Elon took over the platform. I also agree that he's a brilliant technologist, and so could better things happen on the platform, but I don't know how to separate the two right now. So from my standpoint, my vote as an individual is one of a lot of hesitancy right now and frustration that are people thinking bad thoughts, whether they get to say them or not? Yeah, but do we really have to encourage it? Isn't there enough hate in the world? And why would you unleash that beast? I mean, I've been personally targeted with it recently in social media for my ethnicity. So it's real and it's not okay. So that's my view. Is I care about people who are executives there that work really hard to build a great platform, and were unceremoniously dumped. And of course that happens in corporate America all the time. But it's hard to just really untangle all that and have just a singular business point of view, because it's the landscape of our culture and human behavior too. So that's as terse of an answer as I can offer right now. And I don't purport to be an expert, except that I've been an early participant, really early, like top, I think 0.5% of Twitter users, and an advertiser. And then the rest is just about being a human being.
Yeah. I mean, you've experienced, as you said, you've experienced hate coming at you, and you were early in the medium. That's a very unique perspective. Well, not maybe unique. There might be And, you know, it sounds like there's a lot of
Right.
people that are experiencing that. And so as we look at it, and it's fascinating to look at it as we've had this discussion and look at all the change that's going on there, and a large portion of it being bad or evil or new, you know, people coming back into it that shouldn't have really been maybe on the platform at all. But it's a representation of our culture for sure, which is sometimes hard to look at, you know, when you watch this stuff. And I've seen it on Facebook, you've seen it on every platform. You're like, oh my God, people say that kind of stuff. And you want to think, is that a robot? I hope that's a robot, because that's horrifying. And that people actually put that in, you know. Oh, yes. So let's end on a positive note. Kitty, you have a wonderful,
Yep.
you have a wonderful finish to our conversation that I
Yes.
want you to put forth on a very,
Okay.
very, very up note.
Great. Well, thank you to both of you. We put a lot of thought and consideration into the pairings for Think and Link, and this has been a great one. Such a pleasure to meet both of you. So I'll close today with a quote that I found on Tom's website, and I just love the future focus of this. So related to change, related to culture, etc. You said the skill is understanding what technology means, which rules of the past it challenges, which new moats it creates, which new behaviors change business models. I think now will be a time for thought and imagination and bravery. Bring it on. So as we go in, those are your words, Tom. So as we go into 2023, I think that's a fabulous perspective. So thank you both so much for your wise words today. Thank you to all of our viewers. Lots of comments from Morgan and Toby and Bob, Todd, Lori, Kim, Ria, and Dave. Thank you guys and everybody else who tuned in.
Yes,
Thank
thank you
you
for your amazing honesty, both of you. This was great, wonderful discussion. And for those of you here in Minneapolis, it will be both virtual and in person. And so we'll have our wonderful one on January 19th, Joe Pine, and now I've forgotten his name. Well, Joe Pine will be here locally, author of The Experience Economy. Frank Rose, excuse me. Thank you, Frank Rose. So thank you both for doing this, and I hope you have a wonderful holiday. And again, it was an amazing discussion and very inspiring.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, everyone.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.